Hey everybody, I just wanted to make this video regarding Jon Stewart Show and how it's ending on Apple. There's this idea that he was fired or it's ending because of the negative things he could be saying towards China. And I've done some research on this matter. I've watched Jon Stewart growing up, and I think I have a small difference of opinion when it comes to this matter. Now, when you go on public forums like Reddit or Yahoo, the general consensus is that Jon Stewart was the Jon Stewart show was ending on Apple because he wasn't appealing to Chinese. He was saying negative things towards the Chinese government, or it could be like that. That he wanted to discuss more things about China and artificial intelligence, which just didn't work with Apple. And working with Apple doesn't necessarily mean that you have to act in a certain way to appease Apple. It doesn't mean that you even have to act a certain way towards China necessarily. I think the real thing that happened was that Jon Stewart wanted to give a more nuanced opinion and a more open view and bring on numerous perspectives that of China that aren't really welcomed in the United States. Because whether you're left or right in the United States, we have a common view towards China, which is China is bad, right? So anytime we think about China in the United States nowadays, we always view China in a bad way. We have a lot of memes, we have a lot of rhetoric that presents China in a bad way. We have this idea that anytime you think of China, they're an autocratic country and the worst one, which is just not true, right? Israel is definitely more autocratic than China, but we love Israel for some reason. And the United States partners with dictators all around the world and even implants their own puppet governments all around the world too. And the United States imperialist system has definitely had impacts from history till this day that negatively influence and impacts people's lives globally. And Jon Stewart was somewhat of a critic of the United States imperialist system. So I don't really think the reason why Jon Stewart was canceled was because of China or Apple trying to appease China. I think it was Apple trying to appease the United States, because the United States, while Apple does benefit from its relationship from China tremendously, its first customers, first and foremost, are United States Americans and the government of the United States. So actually, when you really want to understand Jon Stewart, he is anti-imperialist in my opinion. There's a few things we can go over. So these videos are really misleading. They don't say word for word or verbatim that this is what Jon Stewart said. They said we're assuming that Jon Stewart was fired because he maybe had a negative opinion towards China, and a lot of the maybe bots or people who don't really understand China or Jon Stewart don't really keep up with these things, and then they assume that Jon Stewart was fired because he criticized China. But actually, in reality, I think that Jon Stewart was giving more nuances, opening more discussions, bringing on panelists like these two to discuss Jon Stewart to discuss China in a more nuanced way, and even criticize the United States and how they played a role that could lead towards outcomes that we don't want in the China and US relationships. So he's more willing to bring on panelists and even have discussions that facilitate that. Hey, is the United States the problem? Have we caused a lot of the problems? Are we making China to seem worse than what they're not? Or what about us? Do we forgive and overlook a lot of the bad things that the United States does till this day? And is it a bit hypocritical? So when you look at the Jon Stewart show, he actually brings on a lot of different types of people that brings out a lot of the problems in America, like the Silicon banking collapse, justice, where our money goes, things like that, made in America and globalization. So he's going to give way more nuances. He's not going to have just one strong opinion towards something and the problem with the economy. So if you look at it, and the problem with war, these things go against the American imperialist system. So I think that perhaps Jon Stewart was canceled by the American government, and they're just saying it's China, even though there's no proof of this, because they don't want to bring up instability or negative sentiment towards the United States. I mean, look at this. this this whole season 1 is the residuals of racism. Like, this is probably talking about systemic racism and how white privilege plays a role in America today and how we view foreign affairs or even domestic affairs. This one talks about the economy. This one talks about the problem with the stock market, the problems with U.S. war, probably, the problem with our corrupt and controlled media, the problem with big oil. These are very anti-U.S. imperialist videos. And so you think if he has all these kind of like nuanced opinions and panelists who aren't really pro-United States necessarily and just want the truth or to share their own unique perspectives and opinions, do you think that his view is going to be necessarily different on China? No. This is very much like Jon Stewart. So when Jon Stewart brings on Jessica Chen, and I believe the other panelist, I wish I knew his name. I don't. It was just showed. I just watched this recently. It doesn't seem like he actually has a negative opinion towards China. He's just coming to an understanding. And what these two panelists do is that they discuss more about, I think his name is Zach, Professor of Cornell. I don't know. Okay, so when you have people from like the Asia Society Policy Institute, they have way more nuances and way more expertise than on the actual truth and facts, rather than painting a negative image of China. They want to understand why the world works the way it does. So, you know, they criticize the overhype and the over. They basically said that the balloon was not that big of an issue, and that the United States is pushing for this Cold War mentality because we don't have the threat of terrorism in the United States anymore, and that in the United States we're actually really free and we don't have many problems, but we have to put on this illusion that we're so much better than everybody through American exceptionalism. Another thing they talked about was the how the sanctions on China aren't working. So like all these trade sanctions, all these kind of trade wars, they're not really working against China. It's actually just helping China like innovate and do research and development and, you know, deleverage from the United States. So these trade wars are not working against China, and you can tell by the prosperity in their economy and how it's growing if you just look at GDP. And then you can say GDP is fake. Well, where is GDP not fake, right? And yeah, they did say we gutted their global and manufacturing sector, but that was a choice by American corporations and the government. You know, it was the American corporations, the government, that took our jobs overseas. It wasn't China. And, you know, you have to understand that China was a victim of, you know, colonialism and imperialism. You know, they were a beaten down country that was exploited by Westerners, quote unquote, and that negatively impacted their economy. So they had to boost up their economy by playing the game of capitalism, and they just did really well, and the United States doesn't like that. And yeah, this person on the right talks about how like we claim China's evil and that their military is a concern, but when you really look at China, like the United States is surrounding China militarily. Right? Is China surrounding our military? Is China surrounding our military or our state? No, they're not. Are we surrounding China? Yeah, we are. And so basically these two give a more fair opinion on I want to show this video. I just don't know if there's going to be a copyright issue. But yeah, when it comes, it's basically democracy versus autocracy. But is the United States are we a democracy? Like, to what extent? And then like what indexes are you using to like measure the United States being a democracy? And then China, is it an autocracy because of the position that it's in and was? Will that change over time as they see economic prosperity? And in the United States, do we see our democracies and freedoms being taken away? Like, are we losing our rights? Are we losing our freedoms? Are we losing these privileges that we had because of the exploitation of colored people and minority groups and foreign economies? Like, do we only have democracy when we think it's democracy? Did black people in America feel like we had democracies? Did same-sex marriage have that right? Do minorities in America have it? Do immigrants in America have it? Who are you measuring this to? Like affluent white people? Yeah, they have a democracy, but Do poor white people have it? Do most of Americans have it? I would argue that's something to debate, right? So democracy is subjective, and it's easy to say we're a democracy, but basically Jon Stewart goes on to say that, like, with the panelists, that, you know, we shouldn't be China bashing and hating on China because we have a lot of our own problems that we cause and that we continue to perpetuate, and that we don't even fix our own problems, and that, you know, it's sort of like calling the kettle black. So I don't really think that Jon Stewart was, this show ended, the problem with Jon Stewart ended because he was trying to toe the line of China, or whatever. I think he was just being honest about, like every other video, he gets these very nuanced panelists who have their own opinions and aren't bought out by like American propaganda or American media. And, you know, the United States put 500 million or 500 million dollars into anti-China rhetoric for a bill, and to support those who are anti-China and things like that. I think you'd have to look it up, but basically I don't think the reason why Jon Stewart was canceled was because of he was negative towards China. I think it was because he was trying to give a more fair opinion of China. So yeah, with that being said, I definitely look into this because it doesn't seem right. And a lot of the things you read online, they could be bots and shills, and, you know, I don't even know if they're honest either. You know, it seems like everybody's perfectly fine with the war machine, which is the United States, and overlooking a lot of the problems in the United States. Even if we're in still somewhat of an imperialist country, we overlook these things.